Hello, welcome back to Show and Tell. I'm Billie, and my guest today is Linda Ivell from the UK, who earlier in the year published a book. She's going to tell you about her book, and she's also going to show us some of her Tyrolean. She tells me it's pronounced in the UK. I think here in the US we say Tyrolean, but you get the picture. There it is. So, Linda, I know very little about you. We're going to have an interesting conversation today, I hope. I definitely want you to tell the audience about your book and if there are other books in the works. And we're going to talk about vintage knitting and about the origins of these very unusual sweaters that are now, I guess, dating back almost 100 years, right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. They're quite extraordinary survivors, treasures.
Linda, what part of the UK are you in?
I'm in the Cotswolds, Billie, which is in the middle. I'm in Worcestershire. The Cotswolds sort of spreads across a few counties, but I'm in Worcestershire. I'm in a beautiful village called Broadway. Very privileged to live here. So right in the heart of England.
Broadway, it sounds so New York. That's where I am.
Yes, and do you know what? My postcode is actually NY. I always think that's quite funny.
Now, the sweater that's in the background, it's hard for me to know which are the ones that you knit and which are the ones that are originals from the actual time period. So yeah,
Right.
tell us.
So when I first started writing the book, obviously my radar was really tuned in to finding as many originals as I could, original patterns, and I never dreamt that I'd find actual original pieces of knitwear from the 1930s and 40s. So of course, when I did come across them, it was just such a pleasure, such a joy. And I managed to actually acquire a couple of them. And the first one that I got was this incredible beauty, which I hope you can see, which is a 1930s original. It's quite heavy wool and it's quite dense, thickly knitted. And it's absolutely iconic Tyrolean, isn't it? It's got the Edelweiss, it's got the buttons, it's got the tassels, it's got everything that you could think of as a Tyrolean, typical Tyrolean design. So I was really excited to get it. And I thought, for me, the mission, the ambition and the mission to be able to include it in the book, because I thought, yes, it's interesting to include it in the book, but I want to knit this. I want to recreate it. And more than anything, I want to be able to recreate it as a new pattern that could be used by knitters today who might want to also have a go at it. And by the way, Billie, I'm absolutely delighted that I've seen so many people on Instagram come up with their versions of this. Some people have done the same colors, other people have done their own interpretation. But for me, it's such an honor and such a thrill to think that people have recreated from this beauty and from my pattern that I recreated from it. So the first thing I had to do was work out how this might have been knitted in the first place back in the 1930s. So it was a case of not deconstructing it. I wouldn't dream of doing that, but of actually trying to measure it, work out what yarn they might have used. And I don't know how well it's coming up on screen, but all of the what look like black areas are actually quite heavily cabled. They're all cables all the way round. And inside, the construction of it is quite extraordinary. It was obviously done as a jigsaw puzzle, done in pieces that were then put together and then added to, and the embroidery, of course, came last. But
how many pieces would you say there are? There's two fronts. Is there more than one section to the back?
Yes, there's the big section across the back, but you have to add the triangle, the bottom triangle on after you've done the yoke. But before you do that, you have to knit two pieces at the bottom that are then stitched together down the middle.
And why do you think that was? Why would they do the black in two sections of the back?
I really don't know. But
for shape?
Maybe. I mean, the thing about the cable, especially when you draw it in with a drawstring like this, is that it actually creates this really beautiful draped effect, which if I undo the tassel, you'll be able to see what I mean. So, it's quite straight pieces. You knit 4 straight pieces, so they're quite easy to get on with. You knit 4 straight pieces, 2 at the front, 2 at the back, and then you join the back ones together, and the whole shaping is achieved by this tassel that draws it all in. The tassel in itself is a wonderful Tyrolean kind of hallmark, if you like, of the style. So the idea was to recreate it, and by working out what wool was originally used, it actually matches up to a modern double knitting. That's a UK double knitting. I don't know if it's the same for you in the States.
I think it probably is.
But that's great, because so many of the vintage patterns are a bit of a challenge because they're 3-ply, original 3-ply, which we can't really get anymore. What we call 3-ply is much too fine. And if you try and knit a vintage pattern in modern 3-ply, it will come up too small because it's a much finer yarn. What we can't get anymore is anything like what they used to have in the 30s and 40s as 3-ply, and even into the 50s. So, I mean, it looks like this. This is an original ball of original 3-ply, as you can see. And it's finer than our modern 4-ply, but it's thicker than our modern 3-ply. It's between the two.
Wait,
So,
wait, this is an area that I really want to explore with you, because
it's what
the
fascinates.
British system is completely different from the American system, different size needles. And then you have the old English needles that are even a different size than contemporary needles. So I wish everybody would just go to millimeters, and then we would all be on the same page, no confusion. But in any event, when you're dealing with vintage patterns, they're using usually an old needle. So I have this chart that I created where I can look up what a UK 12 actually means. It's a very thin needle today, even though 12 sounds like a big number. But with the yarns, when people speak of 3-ply and 4-ply and 2-ply in the UK, I think it's different from here.
Probably.
So, DK, I have a feeling, is the same here and where you are. But then when it starts to get finer, I mean, we can probably go by needle size, like what's the needle size, or what's the number of stitches per inch.
That's the thing to go by. Go by the number of stitches, because needle size will vary according to the knitter, and it will also vary very much by, you know, whether the pattern is vintage or modern, as you say, because, you know, they were using, I mean, for example, during the 1940s, when there was a serious wool shortage, they would use the finest possible wool on the largest possible needles in order to make it go further. So if you go by the needle size and try and work it out, you can really come a cropper, because, you know, it makes too tight. You can't get the needle into the yarn because you've got a very fine needle on a very fine yarn on a very big needle. So I wouldn't recommend going by needle size. But going by tension, what you call gauge, is by far the best kind of solution. And what I did do, if I can jump into the book, is, because this area fascinates me, how we can convert it. I did a whole chapter in the book called Mastering Vintage Yarns and Patterns. And I got hold of some original yarns and I knitted up, I don't know how clearly you can see them, but I knitted up a whole load of samples to the standard 10 centimeters or 4 inches of a tension size, like for like, with each one of the yarns, to compare how vintage yarns behaved in comparison with modern yarns, just to see how much bigger or smaller and how they actually behaved. And I think I would certainly recommend that that's what people go by. And there is, as I say, there's a whole section in the book on how to master that.
I think that alone is a reason for purchasing the book. Just that alone. Of course, one could attempt to do that themselves. So let's go down that path a little further. So if you're trying to get 7 stitches to the inch, what ply are you referring to? Contemporary versus vintage?
Okay, so a modern yarn, a classic 4-ply, is 28 stitches to 4 inches, which equates to 7 stitches per inch. So if you see that in a vintage pattern, you're safe using a modern 4-ply, because that will work. Now, I think, do you call that fingering or sport?
I think it's fingering, I think.
Okay. I mean,
Cord is heavier. So yeah, once you're in the 7 stitches to the inch, I think you're into fingering.
okay, because I don't know if you are familiar with cascade yarns.
Somewhat.
I think they're Canadian. Forgive me if they're not. But they produce a range of 4-ply, which is so beautifully fine. I'm not being paid by them to advertise them, by the way. This is just my preference. And I know a lot of people who knit vintage really like their yarns because they have a very vintagey feel to them. They're pure wool and they come up by far the closest. So this little baby here is knitted in vintage 3-ply, the original thing. And like for like, the Cascade was the closest. And I'm just thinking the reason I've mentioned them just now is that they do call this yarn fingering. So I'm thinking that that's probably what, you know, over the herring pond you would call what we call 4-ply. But the point is that if you're looking for a pattern that's 7 stitches to an inch, and by the way, most vintage patterns only ever quote 1 inch. They don't quote 4 inches. That's quite a modern thing. We think
6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. So exactly, but you won't find it. It won't tell you 4 inches or 10 centimeters in a vintage pattern. It will just give you 1 inch. You won't find many because the majority of their patterns were much smaller than that. You're likely to find 8 stitches to an inch, which works out at around between 32 on to 4 inches. So that's what that looks like compared to a modern one. Here's a Rowan one. The Rowan.
Wait, once you're into 8 stitches to the inch, wouldn't you be into a lace weight yarn?
No.
You're still at fingering.
You're still in fingering. What you have to do then is adjust your needle size. And I know it's a big bugbear with people these days about tension squares. A lot of people don't like doing tension squares.
Oh, no, you must.
Exactly.
End of conversation.
But I know, I quite agree. But so many people think, you know, oh, what a bore. It's going to stop me from getting on with the pattern. I'm excited to get on with the pattern. I don't really want to wait and do a tension square and it'll be fine anyway. It'll all work out. I really would urge, especially if you're trying to find a modern comparison. And even with the modern yarn, don't assume that if it says on the ball band that it's going to be 28 stitches to 4 inches, that's what you're going to knit. You really do need to check it. So that's my little moral for the day.
Yeah, more than that, I was going to say, if you want it to fit, like people watching, look at the sweater on the mannequin. If you knit that at a different gauge, it's not going to be fitting on the mannequin in that way. It might be very oversized and the shoulders might not be where you want the shoulders to be. Look at Linda's shoulders. They're in the absolute perfect place. If you're not getting gauge, you're not getting that fit. So yeah. I think the reason why people love a lot of modern patterns is fit doesn't really matter. Like this is not a vintage pattern. So whether this comes to here or to here, sure, doesn't much matter. You know, it's kind of like oversized anyway. But with vintage stuff, I think it's absolutely critical, unless you've already knit with the yarn and you know how it behaves and you know the gauge that you're going to get. It's like for vintage knitting, I think you just have to bite that bullet. Now, for me, the problem is sometimes I do my proper swatch, and then when I knit the sweater, it's something different. It's not even the measurement. Sometimes it's the stretchiness of the fabric. So like that green section where you have all that embroidery, I'm assuming that there's no give there. You better get the gauge just right.
Well,
there's a stretch.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I stand corrected.
So yeah, I mean, it depends. It sounds silly, but it depends how you do the embroidery. You know, if you go across stitches diagonally, then you will get quite a bit more give. And what you can do while you're embroidering, obviously, is as you do the stitches, is just make sure that, you know, every few stitches, just give it a little gentle stretch, just to make sure that it's kind of giving in and out. Wool is so forgiving, really. You know, you've got to be really tight with it for it to stay that rigid. It does happen. Oh, it does happen. But I think if you kind of tell it who's boss and keep kind of easing it, then it does cooperate. But yeah.
Now, getting back to the yarn for a moment, the Cascade, I think that I have used Cascade that was 2-ply. They call it maybe something else, but there are 2 strands wrapped around one another. So that's also confusing because it's maybe your 3-ply or your 4-ply. That's why I'm completely confused, because there's so many different ways of naming things.
Yes.
Not just the number of strands. Like, I'm thinking I've used Color Mart yarn. It's super fine. It's like cobweb, but you can combine strands of it. So I could get 3-strand, 4-strand, whatever, however many strands I want, and build my own yarn, which I sometimes do if there's some peculiar gauge. So I've knit things, well, one thing that was 46 stitches to 4 inches. So,
whoa, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's more than 11 stitches to an inch.
It is.
Yeah, the only way you're going to get that is if you're using something cobweb, and maybe you need to double it. So that whole topic is very fascinating, and I'm glad that you went into it in your book. Yeah, so let's talk about more sweaters, because the one you're wearing looks very interesting.
Thank you. Well, this is a 1930s pattern. It's in the book, and it's from the 1930s by one of my favorite vintage pattern designers called Copley's, who went out of business in the 1970s. But during the 1930s, they were one of the leading designers of knitwear. So that's the one I'm wearing. That's the ladies' Tyrolean coat that they issued in, I would think, the mid-30s, round about 1935, 36, round about that date, judging by where it sits in the sequence of their patterns and, the hairstyle and all the other clues that we look for in a vintage pattern. So that's the one I'm wearing. And what I loved about this one, particularly knitting it, was how clever the sleeves were, that there's no padding, there's no reinforcement, it's just very clever pleating. You need to use a yarn that's got quite a bit of body to it. If you use something that's too soft, like a lot of the Peruvian kind of very soft yarns, llama yarns and all those sorts of things, alpaca type yarns, they're very soft, they're very slippery. I don't get on with them particularly well. They are beautifully soft, but they're a bit too slippery for me, and I like something with a bit more kind of solid body to it, particularly when you're doing something like this where the yarn needs to hold its own shape. But what a shape. I mean, what a clever pattern to be able to do that it's just sitting there on its own, which is something that I think is definitely worth finding the right yarn for.
Talk about the colors. How do you go about choosing colors, and do you know what the original colors were like? When they mentioned this is the yarn that they suggested, do you have samples of those vintage yarns to know what the colors were?
No, because they called all their yarns the most beautiful lyrical names, like Summeritz or May Apple and Chrysel Pink, and you think, what are they talking about? And because all the patterns tended to be in black and white, you don't have a clue. So you have to kind of go with your instincts to a large extent. I have got a shamefully large collection of original vintage yarn, which I treasure. I really, really treasure it. I love to see how the originals behaved, and particularly with the colors. And there are some colors that we just can't get anymore. At the moment, they're not in fashion, and the manufacturers don't seem interested in reproducing real vintage colors to a large extent. And I know from the vintage knitting community that, we'd all love to have those colors back again. And some of the manufacturers come close, or they make it in a different weight. But we're at the moment, there's quite a few colors that we just can't get. If I can show you one of them.
Yes, I want to hear what those colors were so I can keep my eyes out.
So this, to me, is the holy grail of all vintage 3-ply knitting colours. It's what we would call deco green. I think it's coming up a bit bright on screen. It's a little bit softer than that in real life, a bit more brown, I suppose. It's won by Patons and Baldwins, who are still going strong after, well, certainly 100 years. They've been going since the late 19th century. So they've really stood the test of time. They're part of a much bigger group now, but they are still known as Patons. And they give them numbers. So, they don't even give you an indication of what they are, but you get them in numbers. And of course, back then it was mostly skeins. You rarely got things in balls of wool until the 50s. So through the 30s and 40s, you'd have got a skein of wool, which you'd have to then wind and knit from that. But this is a typical vintage colour that you really can't get anymore in a fine wool. You can get thicker ones, but you can't get it in a fine wool. So something like that is to me, it's a kind of benchmark. I'm looking for something that's going to be as close to that as possible in weight and feel and colour. So that's the challenge, that's the mission. With this particular cardigan, as you were asking me about colours, what was wonderful with this pattern is that even though it was back in the 30s, Tyrolean knitwear back then was very much classic cream background, green, red, yellow, not even blue. Those were the Tyrolean colours that were typical for all the trimmings that went on a cream background of a Tyrolean design. What was great with this Copley's pattern is that it said, try some different colours. Try, in their words, mermaid and blush pink and iris, and it suggested all these different colour combinations. And I thought, fantastic. Not everybody wants to knit a cream background with the classic colours. And here you have complete endorsement back then, back in the 30s, with an original pattern that says you can knit these Tyrolean jumpers in different colours. You can use reds and blues and greens and pinks. So I thought, how lovely to get a sort of little rubber stamp from Copley's back in the 30s to say, you can knit Tyrolean cardigans and jumpers, no, not jumpers, cardigans. You can knit cardigans and jackets in any colour that you like. So I did have a book that had not an actual sample of wool, but it had a photograph of kind of the company's wool samples, and it mentioned mermaid, and it was this colour, and I matched it to a modern colour, and I thought, well, that's good enough for me. And I thought, if this isn't blush pink, then I don't know what is really. So I was happy to go with those colours. So yeah, although the classic Tyrolean will always be cream background with quite primary colours on it, there's no Tyrolean police, and you can actually knit a whole host of colours, to kind of just to please yourself. So yeah.
Okay, do you have other sweaters that you brought to show us?
So the other Tyrolean original that I've got is from the 40s. And this one also is featured in the book. And this one, I'd already started writing about it when I came across this beauty. And so it's the typical kind of cream background. And just a little aside on that one too, is that what we would call cream, they would have called white, because they didn't have any pure whites in wool. They didn't have the bleached white that we're used to, which is why so much of their knitwear looks a lot softer altogether, really. But yeah, just a little word to the wise that if it says white in a vintage pattern, they mean cream. They don't mean what we think of as white. So this was knitted, I'll show you the pattern in a moment. What is absolutely astonishing to me with this one, and what I really treasure, is all the work in the embroidery that this knitter did. I'm assuming it's a lady, but yeah, she would have spent absolutely hours doing all the details. The actual knitted bolero is quite a simple shape. There's nothing really complicated about it, but it's all that embroidery. And again, a real survivor, for its 80 odd years. It really is quite a survivor. So the pattern that she would have used, and I have to say, this is one of the things that I get so excited about, is if I've got the pattern and I then find, I'll show you another one like that, but if you then find an original that somebody lovingly knitted all those years ago from the same pattern that we can get hold of, I think, you know, it just kind of links you, it connects you to them somehow. So that's the pattern that she used. It's a Best Way pattern, prolific pattern designers from the 30s, 40s and 50s. So just extraordinary workmanship on that. So that's another original vintage piece.
I also love the two-tone trim that goes all the way around.
And look, Billie, it's that green, it's that deco green. So yeah, it's the one that got away, it's the one we can't get hold of. But yes, I agree, just that tiny detail just gives it that edge, doesn't it?
And the nice little stitch detail behind the green X's, that there's like,
yeah,
looks like some rows of maybe purl stitches.
Yep, she's done some reverse stocking stitch according to the pattern. And in fact, I know that on the pattern it says to do a little French knot embroidery in the middle of that, and she's obviously given up, bless her, but she worked so hard, I think she's allowed.
I think so.
But those colors, I mean, that, you know, just seeing that, those touches of violet with the red and the yellow, it's
that's lovely, just lovely.
Little
Now, are they always cardigans?
Yes, Tyrolean, from what I found anyway, with all my research into it, the whole point is that you have that feature of the front closure. So if there are some patterns, particularly from the 50s onwards, and certainly during the 70s and 80s, that say that they're Tyrolean, and they have most of the hallmarks of a Tyrolean in that they're embroidered. But the whole point of the Tyrolean, going back to the 30s and how it developed into the 30s, 40s and early 50s, was that you had that front closure, and that's where you put the real kind of showstopper details. You put, you know, different colored edgings, tassels, interesting buttons. That's, to me, one of the key features of whether it's Tyrolean or not. So,
what are the other hallmarks that make it Tyrolean?
The texture behind this, the actual stitches. Before you embroider them, a lot of Tyrolean look very much like what we might call an Aran kind of pattern, because they tend to be pretty much, they fall into three kind of categories of stitches: cables, lots of cables, and bobbles, or lots of bobbles, which may or may not appeal to knitters because they take such a long time to knit. And the other feature is grids, like this one, where you actually create a grid of stitches that acts like a little frame in which you put your embroidery. And the whole idea is to create a kind of textured backdrop for adding embroidery of the colors, because if you don't add some kind of colored embroidery to a Tyrolean, it's an Aran design. It's not a Tyrolean. You need that combination of texture and color, no matter how limited the color is, and no matter what your choice of color is, you do need those touches of color to give it that Tyrolean edge. So it's textures, colors, and I would argue front closure of either a jacket or a cardigan, even if it's edge to edge like this one. You know, it's that front closure, because you can then start doing things with that front band. By the way, in the pattern, this one was fastened with little invisible hooks, but she just left it open, and I think it still has, you know, so much charm.
So far, that's my favorite.
Yeah.
It's very much more subdued. It doesn't have a lot of that heavy texturing like the one that you're wearing.
Yeah.
So do we know the years? Is that is that going more towards the late 40s? Yes, that one.
I'd say this was post-war, yes, judging by the photograph of the pattern and the hairstyle. It's very Veronica Lake hairstyle, long hair parted on the side. So I would say this is kind of mid 40s at the earliest, and probably more like late 40s. But the whole point with Tyrolean is that it never went out of fashion. It moved with the fashions of each decade. So it started off in the mid-1930s with a huge following very quickly. I can talk a little bit about that if you like. It's all in the book, but I can.
Well, did it start in Austria, or that has nothing to do with it, just the name?
Austria has a lot to do with it, but there are two ladies, actually three. There are three ladies that I attribute the beginnings of Tyrolean to, because looking back over it, there were mentions of Tyrolean in publications like Vogue from the 19th century onwards, because walking in the Tyrol, walking in the Austrian Alps was a favourite pastime from the Victorian period onwards. So there was always that interest in alpine kind of culture, alpine, and of course when winter sports started, in the early 20th century, there was a lot of focus on not necessarily Austria, but anywhere in the Alps that could provide winter sports for the elite, and it was very much an elitist sport. And so it kind of started with that. It kind of started with elitist sport in Austria, and the one key lady who really launched the style that I could find was an American industrial aristocracy called Millicent Rogers. And Millicent Rogers was an oil heiress.
I've heard this name.
Yeah. There's a Millicent Rogers museum down in, I think it's in Texas, I think. Forgive me if that's wrong. But she traveled all over Europe, and she was very much the elite, and she was very much like today, she was a celebrity, she was a fashion icon, she was in all the magazines, she was photographed by all the leading photographers, and she was a very close friend of Elsa Schiaparelli. And Schiaparelli was starting out with her kind of avant-garde fashions. I like to think of her as the enfant terrible of the fashion world in the 30s. And there's a lot written about how they inspired each other, how Millicent Rogers was completely devoted to what Elsa Schiaparelli was doing, but to an extent, she was Schiaparelli's muse and gave her lots of ideas. She was a hugely creative woman and always kind of one step ahead of fashion. So she and Schiaparelli got on very, very well. And she also had a lot of her clothes designed by Mamboche in New York. And with all of that going on in her life, everywhere she went, whatever she wore was the latest thing. Everybody wanted to be like Millicent Rogers. And her first husband was an Austrian count, whose name I won't even attempt to pronounce. But so she was, you can imagine this incredible celebrity, beautiful woman, tall, very model-like, incredibly sophisticated, incredibly wealthy, starting off this fashion of wearing Schiaparelli's designs. And in 1933, Elsa Schiaparelli designed a knitted Tyrolean hat, which was modelled by Millicent Rogers in Harper's Bazaar of that year, photographed by Horst P. Horst, the famous photographer.
I'll try and find that photograph and put it here so people can see it.
Sure, okay, Billie. Otherwise, I can send you a link to it.
I'm sure it's online.
Oh, it will be. And that was it. Everybody wanted a knitted Tyrolean hat, just like Millicent Rogers. So you start to get patterns for Tyrolean hats. And then before no time at all, she's wearing kind of early Tyrolean style cardigans. And she obviously, she's not the only one that started the fashion, but it certainly snowballed from what she started. She had, I think, 5 husbands in her life. And husband number 1 was a Tyrolean count. And husband number 3 was also an Austrian. And she lived in Austria with him, and she was determined to wear Austrian dress while she lived in the Tyrol. She wanted to fit in. She went and studied all the Austrian designs at the Innsbruck Museum. She did drawings, handed them over to her dressmaker and said, I want to dress like this. And sure enough, every day that she lived in Austria, she dressed in traditional Tyrolean costume. So already she was quite an eccentric, but everything she did was, the press just absolutely, followed her everywhere. And so if any one person launched the Tyrolean style in the 30s, I think I would have to attribute it to her, jointly with Schiaparelli. And meanwhile, in Britain, we had a lovely young actress called June Clyde, who was American by birth, but who had married an Englishman. I'm talking a lot.
No,
Married an
it's
Englishman.
fascinating.
And she got her idea. I'm not sure where she got her original ideas for a Tyrolean jumper. So she modeled and endorsed her own Tyrolean jumper with Coakley's, who I mentioned before, who designed this one too. And what I absolutely loved about this one in particular was that you can date it to the day. That on the 16th of October 1936 in Picture Goer magazine, bearing in mind how much anything to do with the cinema was pretty much like today. It was, if a film star was wearing a particular fashion, everybody wanted to copy it. So this was the pattern, June Clyde's Tyrolean coat, that is the first one that I can date. It's one of the earliest ones that I found, but it's also the first one I can date very specifically. And from a knitwear historian's point of view, finding a precise date is just a gift, from heaven. 16th of October 1936, how precise is that? So I would say that she started this whole thing in Britain whilst it was bubbling away throughout Europe and America particularly, and so that's where it would have started, really.
What a great story. I'm just wondering if Wallis Simpson factored into this anywhere, because she also was a fan of Schiaparelli.
Well, she was. Well, she actually, in terms of dates, she followed Millicent Rogers. She actually she went to Mambouché, the same designer as Millicent Rogers, and she got him to create her honeymoon going away wardrobe, which was all based on Tyrolean style. Very few photos of it that I've been able to find, but she also took her honeymoon with the Duke of Windsor in Austria, in the Tyrol, and wore very Tyrolean clothes. Very much inspired by Millicent Rogers, and it's definitely that way round. So yes, she would have had certainly an effect on the fashion of the day, because nothing's new. We still look to these famous people and to these celebrities as kind of icons of new fashions. So
let's digress a little bit, because I just want to slip in here that this past January, my husband and I went to Paris to see the Schiaparelli exhibit.
wow,
because I had knit one of her sweaters, 1927, 1928, the bow knot sweater. And it was in an exhibition, and I wanted to see the original.
You had to see that, yeah.
But I remember in my early conversations with you a couple of years ago that there was some French connection. You are descended from
My mum was French. Yeah, my
Your
mum
mother was French. So that's why when you said enfant terrible, you had this perfect accent.
I spent my early years until I went to school, till school started, which in those days was 5 years old in Britain. My father was English, my mother was French, and I flitted between both countries until I started school. And then from when school started, I did always spend a lot of time in France every year, but I really did live in Britain, and you know, that's where my main roots. I do feel like I've got roots in both countries and both cultures, and I feel very privileged to have that. As a teenager, I wasn't impressed. You know, I wasn't impressed with being made to speak French and made to go to France. It sounds awful. You know, everybody used to say to me, "You're so ungrateful," you know, being made to go to France. But it took me away from the life, you know, as a young person. It was away from my friends, it was away from home. But now, as a grown-up, sort of, I'm eternally grateful that my mum did insist on it, because she's given me this whole other culture that I feel very comfortable in both.
And you're bilingual, clearly.
She wouldn't let me be anything else.
I mean, it's just incredible for most Americans. I mean, I'm not sure if I think my audience is mostly American. I think it's also safe to say most Americans are not able to speak other languages. There's a lot of Spanish spoken here, but yeah, I mean, those people are bilingual because they are conversant in English. But many Europeans, as we know, speak multiple languages, not just two, because the countries are all so close. So yeah, it's really something that I'm a little envious of. You had the best of both worlds, England and France. Wow.
You know, Brits are not great at languages generally either. You know, the British are notoriously, because everybody speaks English, the British are, I won't say lazy, but the British kind of have a certain expectation that anywhere they go in Europe, everybody will speak English, probably in the world. You know, most people will speak English. So I would say Europeans are amazing at picking up each other's languages, including English, but probably the British are less kind of keen to learn other languages.
Well, a lot of the other European languages are Romance languages, so they all have the same roots. And, you know, if you speak French, it's not a big leap to speak Italian. If you speak Italian, I think it's also not a big leap to speak Spanish. And if you speak Spanish, maybe Portuguese is next door. So yeah, it's just the way it is. But lucky you to be one of those Brits who is also fluent in French and comfortable going between the two countries.
Yeah.
If only. I mean, I would just love to spend more time there. Okay, what else? I know there's more stuff behind you.
There is more stuff behind me. So this one, Billie, is one of the ones I got very excited about. I owned this pattern, this beautiful Fair Isle pattern. It's by a designer company called Mariners, and who were strong from the sort of 30s, 40s onwards, but I think their heyday was in the 50s. I would date this definitely as post-war because it's a longer line design, excuse me. But apart from Tyrolean designs, my other love is Fair Isle. I love knitting Fair Isle. It's my happy place. I absolutely love watching it grow. I love the feel of it and, you know, how you actually work it. So my ambition was to knit this one, and I'd started collecting yarns, original yarns, as much as I could to be able to recreate this, and was very excited about it. And then I found this, which is from that pattern. So again, incredible condition. It's a tiny bit kind of matted from washing, but it's very wearable. It's still got a certain amount of its stretch, and it's very wearable, and it's the exact knit from that pattern. So I was so excited.
And it fits you. I mean, how much luckier can you be?
I know. I was so thrilled when I found it. And it's got the zipper, which the pattern suggests, which is another kind of post-war detail. I know the zips were very popular for knitwear because when they first started to be introduced, they were the latest thing. So everybody wanted to display them and have them as a feature and a decoration. So they do come up in a lot of 1930s patterns for both men and women, for various jackets. And you almost feel like the design's been worked around the zipper just to include a lightning zip, as they were called back then. And then from the late 40s onwards, they become another very much desirable feature. So I like the fact that it's got its little original zipper in there. but it's the most beautiful Fair Isle. And she's obviously, I can't assume that the knitter was a lady, but the knitter has used the exact colours that they suggested. So going back to what you were asking me earlier about trying to match up colours, when you've got an original pattern that tells you, you know, use these colours, and you find an original that is clearly in exactly those colours, you've got a benchmark, you know. So for example, Riff Red, what does Riff Red look like? Well, we can only guess. But there it is, there's Riff Red. It's actually quite a rusty red. It's like a brick, more, we would call it brick red. But
Oh my God, this is like a home run out of the ballpark with the bases loaded, to use an American baseball analogy. I mean, this is like the top. It doesn't get better.
So there we have an original late 40s Fair Isle and its original pattern, which, you know, from an, as I say, from a vintage knitwear historian's point of view, is just gold.
Now, do you think this would have been knit in the Shetland Islands?
No, not necessarily. No. It's very much a 40s shape, you know. It's got the kind of decreases down to a smaller waist and then out again across the hips. So it's not what anybody, I think, would call a typical Shetland shape. But even from the 1930s onwards, you could get Shetland wool, and Shetland was a kind of brand, if you know, wasn't it? It's always been a brand that is kind of a quality mark, if you like, of certainly for knitting Fair Isles of that era. So no, I don't, it may have been, I don't know, but not necessarily. Not all. By this time, Fair Isle was an incredibly popular way of using small quantities of coloured wools by necessity, because there was so little wool around. I mean, wool rationing in Britain didn't end until 1949, and so even when the war had ended and you'd have thought rationing would stop, it didn't. And in fact, after the war, the supply of wool got worse. It got more and more scarce in Britain, because what wool was now being produced more generally after the war effort was over was being shipped abroad for export. And so the home market had less and less wool, not more and more. So people were finding all sorts of ways of using smaller quantities of what they had. That said, the new designs after 1946 were much, much longer. So you would have been using more wool anyway. So swings and roundabouts.
How many colors are in that Fair Isle?
How many colors are in this Fair Isle? Well, let's count them up. Let me see. You see, I love this. They call the colors Saint Ninian. I know. So dark natural, so Saint Ninian, Rona blue, Magnus blue, Skerries blue, Fettler green, Northern green, Linger gold, Hillswick brown, and Scalloway red.
So I think I counted 9.
Right. So there it is. That's one of my real treasures. Because
Fantastic.
it's very, and I do have one other that I acquired much more recently, which was, as soon as I saw the colors, I thought, oh, that's for me. I have to have this. It's this one.
Darling.
It is, isn't it? It's just so adorable. Little bit of cabling around the yoke and also around the edges of the sleeves, but it's the colors. I'm absolutely in love with the colors. A kind of really warm brown, very warm brown, and that golden yellow, a really bright minty green, and burnt orange. Who would have thought of putting those colors together? But yeah, that's,
well, it's like fall, like, you know, fall
yeah.
colors.
Oh,
Except for the green. I mean, the green is fading as the fall colors are coming in. It's interesting because it doesn't have the typical rib neckline.
No, it doesn't. I've seen patterns like this, particularly in the 30s. The 30s often had quite wide necklines, quite easy wide necklines. And I think the typical little collars that we think of are much more kind of, I've never thought about it before, but I wonder if they actually came about as a way of a little bit of extra warmth, you know, during the 40s, when they were trying to make their own clothes as far as they possibly could, even in the whole environment of restrictions and lack of resources. But yeah, I don't know, that's just a guess. But yeah,
Lovely. That's also embroidery that's going around.
yes, it's all embroidered around the yoke.
So I wanted to ask you about embroidery, since it's such an important feature of most everything you've shown us. When you're doing it, are you just doing it freehand, or do you have some kind of a pattern that you apply? Are you using an embroidery ring, or you're just holding it in your hand? Like, tell me a little about the process.
Just holding it in my hand, basically. So no embroidery ring. I think that would potentially distort the stitches of the knitting, where you actually kind of clasp it round. So yeah, it's with Tyrolean, it's probably easier than it looks, just because you've got that grid. I'll show you couple of different ones. So you've got, for example, on this one, I deliberately included this pattern.
Oh, cute.
Yeah, I deliberately included this one in the book because it's not cute flowers, and I thought not everybody wants cute flowers. You know, some people will want something just a little bit more kind of a bit less floral. So this particular one had dots. It's dots of color that you create with kind of, you know, overlaid stitches. So again, you know, you do it regularly through the cable stitches that you've got as the background,
as opposed to doing a bobble.
Yeah, as opposed to doing a bobble. Exactly. Yeah. And then this one, this is a 1951 pattern, and on this one you've got a different kind of frame that's created by bobbles. So you get a little inverted triangle of bobbles, and you put your embroidery in the middle. And this one was the simplest embroidery of all. It was just, you know, 4 little lazy daisy stitches and you're done. You've got your flower. It's enough to give it that Tyrolean hallmark. It's just enough to do that. So yeah, so that's how, and also very often, if they have got that kind of intricate embroidery, the pattern actually gives you a little grid and says, you know, put the flowers. They give you like a little diagram of the jumper and say, or of the cardigan, and say, place them here. So you just do a bit of measuring and you do a bit of pinning so that you can actually outline where you're going to put your embroidery.
Wow.
I'm not an embroiderer.
It's a whole other avenue.
You know, I had to learn a lot quickly with doing the Tyrolean designs for the book, because, you know, we all did embroidery at school. We all knew how to kind of handle a needle with embroidery thread or with wool. But actually doing it on that sort of scale, I found it very therapeutic. Yes, it does take an awfully long time, but it's very satisfying and it's very therapeutic. And to actually see those colors start to really zing against a background is really enjoyable. And with this,
is it ever done with embroidery floss, or it's always done with wool?
Not always with wool, not at all. No, none of the ones I did are with embroidery thread, but you could do quite easily. And then some of the patterns that I've come across, Tyrolean patterns particularly, do use embroidery silks, and you get a lovely glossy sort of effect. Some of them quite elaborately.
Wow. Well, I hope that people will put in the comments which one was their favorite.
I'd love to know.
I know mine. I know mine. Well, actually, I have 2. You snuck in a couple at the very end, and it sort of shifted my opinion. I'm not so much into all the fussiness of a lot of different flowers and all the different colors. So the one that I liked the most was that cardigan with the green trim, the ivory colored one without the buttons.
This one.
Well,
Oh,
I
no.
like, that's my second favorite.
Right, yeah, I know the one. Yes, the little bolero.
The bolero, right,
Yeah.
right. It seemed a little more subdued, not so much in your face, but they're
I mean,
all like,
this is the
oh
one
yeah, there's
actually.
more.
Well, this is the last one I was going to show, but this
I love that one. This I've seen. I think I've seen other people knit, which,
I've
we shouldn't end our conversation without mentioning that your Instagram page is chock full of these knitting for victory. I'll put it in the show notes and it'll be
Thank
up
you.
here on the screen as well. It's like I don't know, fashion magazine, just one after the next after the next. So go ahead, let me pin this so that we can see it up close.
Thank you. Oh, this one. So this is how the whole book started, to be honest. I mean, of all the Tyrolean patterns that I've been asked to knit as commissions, this is the one that I've knitted more often than any other, with different colored backgrounds, different sizes, different long sleeves, short sleeves. This one has got to be the single most popular 1940s Tyrolean pattern out there. It's so popular. And it was on the strength of this one, the publishers for the book approached me and said, we love this. Would you be interested in writing a whole book about Tyrolean knitwear? Well,
Bingo.
oh yes, oh yes. So yeah, this was the one that kind of started it all. And this one is it's the first one I knitted, certainly, of this style. But important for me is that all the buttons were from my mum. They were on a cardigan that belonged to my mum, and I transferred them across to this. So that has a little bit of special for my mum. But
Can you turn it around so we can see the back?
yeah, sure. The back is quite simple. The back is quite plain. And I do encourage vintage knitters, sometimes you can be so overwhelmed and daunted by some of these patterns, like Fair Isles particularly. You don't have to do the pattern all over if it's too much. You still get a fantastic effect by doing whatever you need to do on the front, and the whole of the rest of it can be plain, and it doesn't really lose anything, I don't think.
Is this intarsia or is it embroidered?
I hate intarsia, Billie. I hate doing intarsia because I don't like how it pulls. There's not much you can do about it, even if you're an expert at it. It kind of pulls, and because of the way wool and stitches behave, there's nothing you can do about those joins, however carefully you do them. The pattern, interestingly, the original pattern from the 40s calls itself a Fair Isle. Now, to me, this is not Fair Isle. To me, Fair Isle is that other one that which carries wool all the way across a row, repeats a pattern. It's, to me, the traditional real kind of Fair Isle with a capital F and a capital I.
Well, today a lot of people confuse Fair Isle. So if it's stranded, sometimes people are mislabeling it as Fair Isle. This company probably meant that it's stranded, maybe.
Yes.
But is it?
Inside. This is a kind of mixture of intarsia and Fair Isle. So it's Fair Isle in the sense that you carry the main background color across those colored stitches, but it's intarsia in that you have to twist every time you change, because otherwise you'd end up with a gap.
Well, I'm not seeing the beige going across the flowers.
I promise you it's there.
It's there?
Red. Can you see
Oh,
it?
wait, let me pin. Hold on.
Can you see it in the red there?
Oh, yes. Now I definitely see it. Okay, so that's it.
And then
it's stranded.
The little bits, the little kind of flowers are embroidered on afterwards. But yeah, it's a bit of everything. It's a bit of embroidery, a bit of intarsia, and a bit of Fair Isle.
So that seems like, for somebody who's starting their first Tyrolean, this might be a good one to choose, because it's not like heavy embroidery, and it doesn't have a lot of cables, and it doesn't have the various parts that you have to put together.
No, I mean,
it's kind of basic.
What I tried to do, there are 14 patterns in the book, and what I tried to do was give a real spread of different levels of skills required and different weights of yarn required, so that there are some chunky, there is some double knitting, and there are some finer 4-ply ones and some 3-ply ones even, so that there was hopefully something for everybody. And there are 1 or 2 patterns, they're genuine 40s, and they're using yarn that will recreate the exact look of the original. But something like this in double knitting is really easy to knit, really easy. But you knit it all in one piece, so you have quite a big piece to start with, but you literally knit the fronts and the back all together until you get to the armholes, and then you start dividing them up, and then you create the yoke at the end. But something like that is, if anybody did want to start a Tyrolean, because once you've knitted that, it just lends itself to embroidery if that's what you'd like to do. The original pattern, as you can see, didn't have embroidered flowers, but it's still very much in keeping with Tyrolean, because you've got that interesting front opening, you've got an interesting yoke, tassels, all the little details that make it Tyrolean. And then you can, if you want to push the boat out and embroider it all over, you certainly can.
You mentioned that you work on commission. How can people find you? Do they direct message you through Instagram, or is there some better way?
I don't have a website, and I'm not on Ravelry. It's Instagram or nothing, I'm afraid. So yeah, a direct message on Instagram. I have got a 2-year waiting list. So if people are prepared to be patient, I do get round to the orders, as my customers will testify. But it is a 2-year waiting list, because it's only me and my 10 fingers. I don't have other knitters, and I don't have a machine, so it is, and I do knit quickly, comparatively quickly. So I'm just very honoured that so many people would like to have the knitwear that I create. But yeah, it's there is that 2-year waiting list. And what I do is, if people are prepared to put their names down on a list, excuse me, there's no obligation at that stage. It's not, I'm not going to hold them to it 2 years later. But it does mean that if you're on that list, then if I do get an opening a little bit earlier, I do contact people and say, I've got an opening just now if you're interested. So yeah, but yes, direct message on Instagram, please.
And are most people who are commissioning you asking for the Tyrolean knits, or there other vintage?
Not necessarily, no. There are certain styles. Everybody loves stripes. I get a lot of commissions for stripes. There are 1 or 2 kind of iconic patterns that people keep asking me to do. So yeah, there's a whole range of different. I love it when people ask me to do something new that I haven't done before. I really enjoy doing that. But otherwise, it's it's a whole range of things from the 30s and 40s. I will do early 1950s designs, but I cut off at the 50s. I don't recreate designs from the 60s or the 70s. They're just not styles I'm particularly interested in recreating. So anything up to the 50s.
In the book, are the patterns that you've given size inclusive?
That is a big vexed question, Billie. It's yeah. The 2 things. The contract for the book limited me to the number of words that could be included, and there just wasn't the extra space to give all-inclusive designs for each of the patterns. And it was a case of cut the number of patterns to make others more size inclusive, or leave the number of patterns in and just give guides and tips on how people could make them bigger, without actually giving the size by size, which makes the book 3 times the size that I was able to actually submit. So I know people generally have got bigger than they were in the 1940s and 1950s. And it's a really difficult one. And in my next book, which I'm writing at the moment, I will be giving more size inclusive patterns, because I've had so much request to do that. So there'll be fewer patterns than there were in the Tyrolean book, but they will be more size inclusive. There are a lot of ways of making patterns bigger, and I know that a lot of modern knitters actually don't like the vintage suggestion. So the biggest suggestion that a vintage pattern would give you on making something bigger to fit you is use bigger needles. And a lot of modern knitters throw their hands up and say, that's not good enough. That's cheating. That doesn't work. And, you know, we want stitch by
Well,
stitch.
it's only going to take you so far. You know, if you have a 50-inch bust, you're not going to achieve that by casting on 200 stitches and using a larger needle.
No, agreed. But up to a point, it does work. It works better than some
Works
people.
for me because I'm only 38-inch bust, but
Exactly.
you know, so you can go from, maybe some patterns might be 34-inch bust. It's not a huge leap.
No.
But yeah, in the book, are you giving small, medium, large? Like, what are the sizes that you are giving? Just one size?
Well, what I did in the book, because of the restrictions of how big the book could be, which, you know, was a limitation, a real limitation. What I did was I translated the original pattern into modern yarn and gave the details of what that sizing was once you'd converted it to a modern yarn. And I gave instructions on at least 2 sizes. And most of the patterns, out of the 14 patterns, I think it's 6 or 7 of them go up to a size 40, and 1 or 2 of them go up to a size 42. But what I've done throughout the book, and there's quite a section in the front as well, is giving people advice on how they can make them bigger than that if they need to.
Perfect.
It does require a little bit of maths and a little bit of calculation, but it's not impossible, and anything is possible. And I think, given that I wasn't in a position to be able to give all those various sizes, it's just a little bit of work that the knitter's going to have to do to work out what they have to do.
But I think that's a really good solution, because then the person learns, if they find another pattern on Trove or somewhere else, that they now have techniques for sizing up anything that they might find, because the reality is the true vintage patterns often were written for just one size.
They were.
And as I've said many times on this program, it's never my size. And it might not be your size either. So it's good to know those techniques.
And it's, you know, there'll be more of that in the next book. I mean, the whole purpose of the Tyrolean book was to look at translating Tyrolean into modern. And yes, it would have been wonderful to have had the opportunity to make it multi-sized, but that's not what I was able to do in that particular book. So I know a lot of people have said, you know, why isn't it in the modern age, why isn't it multi-sized? And I think, well, that's not what the book was commissioned to do. And, you know, it's not me kind of opting out. It's just, you know, you've got a book contract, you have to adhere to it. So
what's the next book and when?
I can only tell you so much, Billie. I'm not being cagey, I'm not being secretive, but you know, the publishers are incredibly kind of protective of what's coming out, because it takes 2 years before it even gets to press. So over that 2-year period, they like to keep all the kind of new information very, very close. What I can tell you is that it's all 1940s. It's all 1940s knitwear.
Not Tyrolean.
Nope, it's 1940s in a much more general way. And that's all I can say at the moment, I'm afraid.
No, okay, good to know that it will be in addition to your Tyrolean
There are no Tyrolean ones in it at all. No Tyrolean ones in there at all.
Good, good.
Different kind of 1940s
it'll
style.
Appeal to maybe a new set of people. So the current book is Timeless Tyrolean Knitwear by Linda Ivell. And Linda, thank you so much. It's been complètement charmant, completely charming to speak with you. I should have practiced my French a little bit more. My light died in the middle of this, so I'm half in shadow, but just so delightful to finally meet you and to see your work and hear more about the book. I hope people will be interested in trying some of these, because they're very quaint, they're very charming. And if you're going to Austria, I think you don't want to be seen in anything else.
You definitely need one if you're going to Austria.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Billie.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.